Hey guys, welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. My name is Michael Rowntree, and I'm going to be hosting today. Josh is out on travel. We have an exciting episode today with Frank Turek, an apologist who's written a book called Stealing from God. Could it be that the very arguments that atheists are leveling against Christians work against themselves? Well, that's what Frank Turek argues, and we're going to talk about it today. It's going to be an exciting episode. Before we dive in, just a couple of things that you should know. First of all, I'd love for you guys to click on that newsletter in the description to this show. It's how you can stay in touch with all the things Remnant has going on. We've got an e-course that's soon to be released. We have actually a couple e-courses soon to be released. We also have a conference coming up in October that's booking out fast. Specifically on the spiritual gifts course, the one of the e-courses that's coming out. It's a 10-week discipleship course on discovering and growing in your spiritual gifts. And so the Remnant guys walk you through in various videos, and we have small groups that we develop. We have Q&As. It's meant to help you grow in this area. It's been a very popular course over the years. Love for you to sign up on that. The last day to sign up is September 7th, and it lasts for 10 weeks throughout the fall. And the other thing that you should know is that we have the Remnant Radio swag. I'm actually wearing a Remnant Radio shirt, but this is from our conference earlier this year. But we have a bunch of other swag. You can go to our website, or you can access it through the newsletter, or you can go to our website, theremnantradio.com, and go to the shop, and you can find some of that there. So now, without further ado, going to turn it over to my co-host, Michael Miller. Michael, how you doing over there in Denver, Colorado?
Good. You guys have the unlucky pleasure of getting to see more of my face rather than just once a week. This week, you get it twice. But I'm good. I am this has been like the craziest, most chaotic week. My wife left town Wednesday morning, as I was telling Rowntree on the phone earlier. And so I'm watching two kids, planning sermons, working, and then had 3 birthday parties to go to this weekend. So I have had my fill. I got a lot of time playing Monopoly with my son, which was good. But I am thankful my wife is back home. Very thankful. She makes life work. She makes it work.
Yes.
Glad to be back.
Absolutely. Well, good to have you on the show. Frank, it's great to have you on the show too. We just mentioned at the top of the show your book, Stealing from God. Maybe as we just get started here, you could just introduce our viewers to yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe about your book, Stealing from God.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Michael Squared. We got 2 of you on this show. That's pretty fun. I was brought up in New Jersey, and so I was Catholic because it's the law. You're either Catholic, Jewish, or you're a skeptic if you're from New Jersey. Went to Catholic high school and everything. And I always believed there had to be a God because there had to be a first cause. But I just never really knew who Jesus was until when I was in the Navy. I met the son of a Methodist minister, and I had so many questions for him. He finally looked at me and he said, "Look, you just need to get Josh McDowell books. Evidence Demands a Verdict and More Than a Carpenter." Those were books written back in the 70s, and they've been updated since. It's basically arguments for Christianity, what we call apologetics. So after I got out of the Navy, I was so interested in this topic, I ran into a man by the name of Norman Geisler, who at the time was like the Michael Jordan of apologetics, which is evidence for the faith. And he was starting a seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I live now. We moved down here just over 30 years ago to go to that seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, which majors in evidence for the faith, apologetics. And along the way, he and I wrote a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And then I later wrote a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. That's what we're talking about today. Also go to a lot of college campuses, high schools, and churches. We have a website, crossexamined.org, and a YouTube channel with like 2,500 videos on it, a lot of them from the college campus, a lot of Q&A. So that's what we do now. We have a podcast too called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
I have actually watched a lot of your videos. It's one of those things that will pop up on Reels even when I'm doom scrolling, which tells you the kind of content I like watching. But I have questions about that I want to ask you later, because I just think there takes a certain kind of like emotional stamina to have those kind of conversations on college campuses. But because I want to dive in more to the content of your book, you mentioned that atheists have to steal from God in order to make their case. Mm-hmm. Unpack what you mean by that. Why do you see that as like one of their fatal flaws when it comes to rhetorical means by which they try to win an argument?
Yeah, great question, Mike. The book is centered around an acronym, CRIMES, CRIMES. And I'll just take one of them. The E stands for evil, to explain what we mean by stealing from God. Atheists often say that evil disproves God. But my point is that you wouldn't even know what evil was unless you knew what good was. And you wouldn't know what good was in an objective sense unless God existed, because what we mean by God is the objective standard of goodness. That's one aspect of his nature. If there is no God, there's nothing ultimately good or bad. Everything's just a matter of human opinion. So in order for us to say that something is not right, that would be evil, we'd have to know what right is. We'd have to know what good is. We'd have to know what moral is. I mean, if you're going to say something's immoral, you have to know what moral is. And nothing is moral or immoral unless God exists. Everything's just a matter of opinion. So when atheists say there can't be a good God because there's too much evil in the world, they're not disproving God. They may be proving there's a devil out there, but they're not disproving God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. So they actually have to steal from God in order to argue against him. They have to steal this standard of rightness, of goodness, in order to say God doesn't exist. So that's an example of stealing from God, and the other letters and crimes go into other areas.
Okay, so on the case for morality, then, how would you respond to the atheist who says, well, hold on here. We don't have to argue for morality from the place of, I have some like good God out in the sky somewhere who defines what it is, because, hey, we as atheists, we believe in evolution, and part of that evolutionary trait is what is going to result in greater human flourishing, and it's clear that when we live virtuous lives, that we or what some would call virtuous lives, that it results in human flourishing. So it's a matter of just pragmatism. Morality actually works, and therefore this evolved over time, and humans developed this way of relating for the survival and flourishing of their species. And you don't actually need God for that, because we evolved into it, and that's the whole principle of evolution. So how would you respond to somebody who argues in that way?
Well, we have a whole section in Stealing from God about that. But notice what's going on here, Michael, is as soon as someone says human flourishing, what are they presupposing? They're presupposing that humans are good and they ought to flourish, that it's morally right to flourish human beings. My question is why? I mean, it's self-evident to us that we ought to, but we can't justify it unless there's a true value to human beings and there's a true purpose to life. And if there is no God, there is no true value to human beings. Who's to say that human beings are right if Hitler says they're not? If there's no standard beyond, say, Mother Teresa and Hitler, it would just be one person's opinion against another. So the person who uses evolution is actually smuggling in a moral law into their system. That's human flourishing. And they're trying to say that that's the goal of most morality. Now, we might agree with them that might be the goal of most morality, but human flourishing isn't the standard unless human beings have value and God has given them that value. Because if there is no God, as I said earlier, everything's a matter of opinion, and there's no purpose to life. If there's no purpose to life, you can't say that loving people is better than murdering them. It's just your opinion.
Okay, well, so if I'm an atheist and I want to push back, what if I want to say, well, actually, this flourishing, I'm using it as sort of the extreme version of survival. It's really just survival of the fittest, and I'm thinking on a species level that hey, the more we cooperate with one another, the more altruism that we express, the more likely we are to survive. So it's less about, say, like, hey, I want everybody to have big fancy jets and flourish in those kinds of ways. It's more just the survival of my species, which is embedded into every creature that has evolved. How, if they're trying to press in and to make it more about survival and flourishing in those ways, how would you respond?
Well, that's what Hitler used. He said he wanted the Aryan race to survive, so he wanted to take resources from the other inferior races in his view, so the Aryan race could flourish and survive. Why is he wrong if there's no God? And by the way, if survival is now a moral category, why shouldn't we rape to survive? That will allow us to pass on our genes. So the person who says this is still smuggling a moral law into the system. and maybe the best way to distinguish this, and I know this may sound a little technical for those that don't study philosophy, but the biggest mistake that's made here is the distance between epistemology, or the difference between epistemology and ontology. Epistemology is how you know something. Ontology is the study of the thing you're trying to know. So you can know right and wrong. You can do right and deny there's a God, right? Epistemology, you can know there's that say murder's wrong and say there's no God. You can know that. The question is, can you justify that murder's wrong if there is no God? And that's where we get into ontology. Is there a standard outside of ourselves that we're obligated to obey? That standard is what we call God's nature. If God doesn't exist, then although we may think murder's wrong, it's not really wrong. And even when you make the evolutionary argument, not you, but the atheist, what they're really saying is they're not really saying that murder's wrong. They're just saying that evolution has made us think murder is wrong. It's more like sentiments. It's not really there's an objective moral law outside of ourselves that we're obligated to obey. It's just that evolution has given us the thought that murder's wrong so we might survive. Okay, so it's not really wrong. It's just a sentiment. The problem is, well, there's a number of problems with it. One is it just makes morality completely about sentiment. But number two is that if it's just about survival, there are many ways you could survive that are immoral. You could survive better by murdering other people. In fact, Stalin murdered 20 million people in order to keep power. And he flourished quite well doing that, right? So survival isn't the end-all goal. Survival is just that. It's survival. And there are so many counterexamples to this that it can't be set up as our moral law, our moral standard.
Okay, you mentioned in your book, you give the image of a house that's built on a cracked foundation. You sort of compare that to atheism.
Yeah.
Now, how does that image help you kind of diagnose cultural arguments, and where in that do you risk oversimplification?
Well, we'd probably need an example. One of the most persuasive and influential philosophers was Immanuel Kant, and probably the best way to know one of Kant's core philosophies was you can't know the real world. Why? Because any data you get from the real world is organized by your mind. So you're not really knowing the real world in itself. You're just knowing what your mind does to it. Now, leave it to a philosopher to come up with this, okay? Right? Now, here's the crack in Kant's foundation. First of all, if Kant is right, then we can't know the real world, which means we can't know about God. We can't even know about one another, really. We're locked in what we call agnosticism about just about everything. The problem with Kant's view, the foundational problem, is that it's a self-defeating viewpoint. Because if Kant were to say, I can't know the real world, I'm going to ask him, how do you know that about the real world? Because you're making a claim about the real world while claiming you can't know the real world. So it's a self-defeating statement. It's like saying, I can't speak a word in English, right? You're using English to say it. So if you grant Kant that premise that you can't know the real world, then his philosophy is coherent after that. But at the foundation, it's self-defeating. And if it's at the foundation self-defeating, then the whole superstructure crumbles. So that's why I use the foundation of a house. You could have a great superstructure on a house, but if the foundation is faulty, that house is eventually going to come down. And that's what happens with Kant. That's what happens with Hume. That's what happens with postmoderns who say, well, there is no truth. I ask them, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? They're uttering truth claims, claiming there is no truth. It's self-defeating.
Okay, well, one of the things that you claim is that atheism is more certainly false than, what is it? Atheism is more certainly false than Christianity is true. Did I say that right? I think I'm saying that wrong. Help me out here.
No, you got it right.
I think it's easier to show that atheism is false than to show that Christianity is true.
There
Why?
You go.
Because look, we know there's got to be some sort of uncaused first cause, right? I mean, that's just seems self-evident. You see there's a creation, there's got to be a creator, okay? That seems intuitive. There's a moral law written on the heart. There must be a moral lawgiver. We're reasoning from effects to cause. That's what we're doing. When we see a creation, that's the effect. We reason back to a cause of creator. We have a moral law written on our hearts. That's the effect. We reason back to a cause of moral lawgiver, right? We have design all around us. That's the effect. We reason back to a cause of designer. You can know that there's some sort of creator God out there who's moral just by the natural world around you. And even the Apostle Paul argues for this in Romans chapter 1. He said that God's invisible qualities are clearly seen through what has been made. So we're without excuse. This is why I said, even growing up in the Catholic Church, I knew there had to be a God. There had to be some cause of all this. I just didn't know who Jesus was. And so to show that Christianity is true, you don't just show there's a God. You got to look into Jesus. Now that requires some historical knowledge, right? And that takes some work. It's not as easy as just saying, well, there's got to be some sort of cause out there, which refutes atheism right away. Mm-hmm. But to show that Christianity is true, you got to do some historical work and discover if Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, there's only two facts you really need to establish to show that basic, or what C.S. Lewis would call mere Christianity, is true. Number one, you got to show that God exists. And number two, you got to show that Jesus rose from the dead. If those two facts are true, everything else falls like dominoes into place, including the fact that the Bible is the word of God. And that's one of the things we talk about in Stealing from God. We also talk about it in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And when people say I'm wrong about that, you know what I say? I say this.
Wrong.
They're wrong. Okay.
You have a few of those recordings, don't you? Can you just share those with us?
I do. Well, this is one of my favorites. If you kind of flub this interview, Michael, you're going to hear this.
You're fired.
We have a board for that.
I'll do my best.
All right.
But I have this dead weight over here in my co-host. So
that's right.
I didn't tell you which Michael it was. I didn't tell you.
You know, the argument you were just making, it actually sounds a lot like Occam's razor, which is sort of a philosophical premise or belief that the simplest explanation is most often the right one. And you're basically saying that Christianity has the most simple explanations. And it's obvious to everything around you. Is that accurate? Am I accurate to say that?
Yeah, Occam might have said it slightly different. Not necessarily the simplest, but I think it went something like, don't multiply causes beyond necessity, right? Like, for example, if one God is all you need to create the universe, you shouldn't be going to polytheism. Or if one God is responsible for the fine-tuning of the universe, which is so extreme, it's hard to believe anybody thinks there's no God after you look at the fine-tuning. You don't need many gods. This universe appears to be the product of one mind rather than several, in other words. So yeah, in Occam's razor, it's sometimes said the simplest explanation, but my mentor was such a stickler for this. He'd say, no, that's not really the case. It was more like, don't multiply causes beyond necessity. And
Gotcha.
You don't need multiple gods to show this universe exists. And you don't need multiple gods to show the universe is fine-tuned or there's a moral law out there. One God will do it. And I think it's quite obvious there has to be some sort of moral cause out there that created and sustains this universe. In fact, sometimes I do this in Stealing from God. Sometimes I ask people, forget the word God for a minute, because there's a lot of baggage with that word, right? I just want to ask people this question. What or who is the source and sustainer of all things? Who is the source and sustainer of all things? It's not me. It's not you. We had a beginning. We're going to have an end. Who's the cause that caused and sustains everything that exists? That's what we mean by God.
Okay, so you've mentioned mentioned several times this kind of intelligent design idea. You've talked about just the way the whole universe was created, and I know in your book you talk about just the meticulous detail of the genetic code that it points to a designer, a divine mind. How would you respond to the counter argument that apparent design does not imply intentionality? In other words, just because it looks like it was designed out there doesn't mean that it actually was designed by a designer. Apparent design doesn't imply intentionality. How would you respond to that common counter argument?
Well, it would have to be based on what the example they're giving me. When I'm walking along the beach and I see in the sand, John loves Mary, I don't assume that the waves made that message or the crabs came out of the water and made that message. I always assume, due to all my prior experience, that a message as simple even as John loves Mary requires a mind, because I never see a message coming from anything other than a mind. So that message is what, I don't know, 15 letters or something, right? When I see a message, John loves Mary, I say, hey, it's got to be a mind. Now, the longest word we've ever discovered is in our DNA. It's 3.2 billion letters long. And I'm not reasoning by analogy here. It's equivalent to genetic code. Your DNA, your genome is a software program. And everywhere I go, wherever there's a program, there's got to be a programmer. Wherever there's a code, there's got to be a coder. If there's a message, there has to be a mind. If I'm going to conclude an intelligent being is responsible for John loves Mary, I have to conclude an intelligent being is responsible for a message that's 3.2 billion letters long. So I'm not arguing from apparent design. I'm arguing from true design. This appears to be true design. And by the way, this is not a God of the gaps argument. I'm not saying, well, just because I haven't found a natural cause for this, God must exist. I'm simply saying I don't just lack a natural explanation for John loves Mary or a genome. John loves Mary and a genome is positive evidence for an intelligent being. So it's not apparent design, it's true design. Sure, you can be mistaken sometimes, but you're not going to be mistaken with John loves Mary or something much longer like your genetic code.
Now, I am going through the book of Joshua right now. We went through Deuteronomy last year, and now we're going through Joshua. And I find so many atheistic arguments against that portray God as this sort of vindictive monster, as the worst caricature in fiction. How do you think that we as Christians should tackle those and engage in those kinds of conversations with people? And how do we avoid, sidestepping into a caricature of God and falling into a straw man argument or arguing with a straw man?
Yeah, that's a big topic, Michael. My friend Paul Copan wrote a book called "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" and an earlier book called...
I've got it up here on my shelf, actually.
Yeah, "Is God a Moral Monster?" Well, the first question I'm going to ask an atheist, if it is an atheist, is by what moral standard are you judging this wrong? Let's just take the Canaanite issue, for example, right? That's going to be my first question. Because here you're stealing a standard from God to say God is immoral. Okay. Now, it's a fair question for an atheist to say, look, okay, I might not have a standard, but you're saying your God's a God of love. Why does he kill the Canaanites, say? Okay, fair question from the atheist, right? My next question is going to be when a God allegedly kills people in the Old Testament, does he have no reason, or does he have some reason for this action? And if you look, it's always because the Canaanites have done unspeakable evil, including sacrificing their children to the molten hot metal Canaanite idol known as Molech, which not just the Bible talks about, even Plutarch, the Greek writer in the first century talks about Molech, and how the village drummers would beat their drums louder so the parents of the children being sacrificed couldn't hear the screams of their own kids. On every college campus I go to, atheists are saying, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop the evil in the world? And here's an instance where in the Old Testament, God is stopping the evil, and the atheists are complaining about it, right? The next question I'm going to ask is, when God kills someone, is it murder for God? And the answer is no. If God is the creator of life and can resurrect it, then it's not murder for him. In fact, if God exists, he takes all of our lives at some point, and it's up to him when he takes them. He can take our lives at 2 years old or 82. That's up to him. And if Christianity is true, people don't die. They just change location. We go from this life to the next life. That's not up to us to decide. That's up to God to decide. And so you have to look at each of these situations and see really what's going on here. If God is loving, and he's infinitely loving, he's also infinitely just. And there's a point where God is going to say, okay, enough of this. I'm going to judge these people. Now, as you know, Michael, Copan has made the argument, I think quite persuasively, that when you read in the Old Testament, which is ancient Near East literature, that there's a lot of hyperbole going on when it comes to these types of commands. Wipe everybody out, obliterate them, kill everything. Copan points out, if you look at Deuteronomy 7, it says, wipe everybody out, the women, children, everybody. Then the very next verse says, and then don't intermarry with them. And you're going, wait a minute. If you wipe everybody out, how could you intermarry with them? And then you see these same people that allegedly have been wiped out. They show up a few chapters later and you're going, I thought he wiped everybody out, because he's just using ancient Near East hyperbole to say, this has to be a pushing these people out of the land. This has to be a beatdown. You have to take this land, and we're going to get the promised people in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah to save the whole world. But these people need to be pushed out because they're going to pollute you. So it wasn't a wholesale massacre. And the last thing I'll say on it is that the reason we know this isn't genocide, first of all, it was for sin. But secondly, God did the same thing to Israel. After the golden calf, he says, kill these people. It's judgment. It's not genocide. It's sinocide. And so you have to look at the distinctions here. We just can't go in the Bible and pull out verses out of context without understanding the broader revelation. And when we do, I think we realize that this was judgment, and it was totally legitimate for God to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Joshua 2, sorry, Michael. In Joshua 2, the very first, before destroying Jericho as they go spy the land, the very first thing they do is find a prostitute who ends up getting rescued and saved and not killed and destroyed. So you see God's mercy being extended from the very get-go of the Canaanite conquest, which I think people often overlook.
And she's in the bloodline of Christ, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What would you say to, let's say an atheist says, well, okay, then what really makes you any different as a Christian from, say, a Muslim? Let's say a radical Muslim who believes in like violent jihad. They believe Allah told them to do this. How is Christianity different than that? And was this some kind of special period where God says, hey, it's cool, go kill people? But now if somebody claims God told them to go kill people, the answer is no. And so maybe help the person wrap their mind around these comparisons to Islam and why that seems to have been okay then and isn't now.
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of differences between what's commanded in the Quran and what's commanded in the Old Testament. First of all, in the Quran, you're killing anybody who's not a believer, the infidel. You can look at Surah 8, Surah 9, Surah 2 has some of this. These are chapters in the Quran. And you can look at what Muhammad allegedly did and, of course, the history of Islam. So jihad is really a war against unbelievers, not because of sin, but just because they're unbelievers. The very specific commands in the Old Testament at a specific time to push certain people out of the land using this ancient Near East hyperbole, as I mentioned, were not to kill them because of the fact that they weren't believers, but because of the gross sin of their culture. And God needed to push them out of the land as he's dealing with free creatures here, to push them out of the land to get his plan of salvation to the entire nation or to the entire world through the nation of Israel. And those commands were just for a specific time at a specific place for a specific judgment for a specific sin that no longer exists today. And it was very unique to that time. It was judgment. So they're completely different in their scope. They're completely different in the reason for the commands. And they're even different. I think the Old Testament commands, as Copan has pointed out, are largely ancient Near East trash talk, hyperbole. But it was the idea that you needed to separate from these cultures, get these people out of the land. And that's what Joshua apparently did.
So I hope this isn't like a massive whiplash, but I want to talk some about your first chapter, causality. And when it comes to the appeal to an undiscovered natural cause, how can Christians balance scientific discovery with confidence that there is an ultimate cause and that must be supernatural. Like, why should we continue pursuing the sciences if we already have this sort of supernatural answer bias, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I would say because God works mostly through natural causes. He doesn't overpower natural causes routinely. If he did, we'd consider them part of natural causes. One of the unique things about a miracle, it's got to be rare. If it happens all the time, we'd go, hey, this stuff happens all the time, right? People say, well, why don't we see resurrections today? Well, suppose we did. What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? You know, you go to somebody and you go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle George just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back, right? No, it's got to be a rare event. So God is largely working through natural causes. And all the founders of modern science were all Christians. In fact, my friend J. Warner Wallace wrote the great book, Person of Interest. He looked at 225 disciplines in science. Every single one of them was discovered by a Christian. You say, but they're all Christians back then. No, they weren't. How come the Chinese didn't come up with this kind of natural science? Because the reason the Christians came up with it is because they thought there had to be a lawmaker up there, and the laws that they are witnessing reflect his mind. Kepler said, when I think of what I see in cause and effect here, I'm paraphrasing him, I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. So we discovered causes and an ultimate lawgiver because of the cause and effect relationship we witness in the natural sciences. And we ought not give up on that. God has given us our minds so we can use our minds to harness the natural laws and how they work to bring forth human flourishing, as Michael mentioned before, to create new medicines and new processes and new ways, new technologies that help the human race. Of course, they can also go the other way too, right? Because technology is not moral or immoral, it's amoral. It depends on who has the technology, whether they're going to use it for right or not, but I digress. The point here is that we ought to be using the scientific method to discover cause and effect inside the universe. But if you keep tracing everything back, you're going to realize you're going to get back to an uncaused first cause. In fact, even the atheists are admitting that space-time and matter had a beginning. Well, if space-time and matter had a beginning, what could have caused that? Only something outside of space-time and matter. Only something that's spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, and also intelligent to have a mind to make a choice. And so I always ask people, I say, hey, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? Most people will say God, but then they'll say, well, how do you know it's the Christian God? And my answer is we don't. Not from this argument alone, not from the argument that the universe had a beginning, which is the cosmological argument. You don't know if it's the God of the Bible. It could be the God of the Bible, but you got 6 attributes from one argument. In order to discover if it's the God of the Bible, you got to look at the historical information we mentioned earlier to see if Jesus rose from the dead. And if he did rise from the dead, then we can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,992 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. But we haven't gotten there yet. No scientific argument gets you all the way to Jesus. You need historical information for that. It might get you attributes of the God of the Bible, but not a complete picture. You need Jesus for that.
Okay, let's imagine that 2 minutes ago, I was an atheist, but you just convinced me to become a deist. I believe that there's a God out there somehow, but now you've made this claim about Jesus that we need this revelation from history. Maybe you would allow for scripture. We need some way to know whether this man, Jesus from Nazareth, who was crucified, according to all the records, not just biblical ones, that he actually was crucified, died, and placed in a tomb, and that his tomb actually was empty, but that the explanation for that tomb is that he rose from the dead. So I'm asking you to take me across the finish line with arguments for Jesus' resurrection. So can you do it?
Oh, well, how much time do we have, Michael? Come on.
Is this in the book, Michael?
I mean, it's a big topic. Let me just ask you this. I would start by asking, I would ask the atheist, what's your explanation for the data that we do have regarding the resurrection of Jesus? What do you think happened back then?
Okay, I'll play atheist. I think the disciples could have stolen the body. I think there could have been a hallucination. I think that I don't know. Maybe there's just grave robbers going around. Who knows? But
all right, let's do the grave robber thing. What motivation would Jewish believers in Yahweh have to steal a body, claim this body resurrected, and then suffer and die for a false claim that this body had resurrected? What motivation would they have to do that?
Yeah, okay. So it probably wasn't them. So maybe it was the Romans.
Convert already, Michael.
Do it. The last thing they wanted was Christianity. Christianity was a pain in their side, was about to be a pain in their side. Judaism already was. Why would they want a new religion? Why would they invent the resurrected Jesus? I don't.
Yeah.
What motivation would they have for that?
So in other words, there's no motive for anybody to try to steal the body.
No.
What about just the hallucination idea? Could it have been, we have these records of apostles claiming that they saw resurrected Jesus. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that 500 people saw him at once. But, clearly these people were really longing and wanting Jesus to still be alive. And maybe they were reading the scriptures a certain way, like Psalm 16, that seemed to indicate a resurrection. And maybe they wanted to believe it so bad that they kind of imagined it. Is that possible?
Yeah, I would ask you if we came to this podcast today, just the three of us, and I started the podcast off by saying, "Hey guys, great to see you. That was a great dream we had last night." What would you say?
I don't recall having the same dream as you.
Yeah. Like, dreams aren't group events, and neither are hallucinations, right? Sure, one person can have an hallucination, but 12? The same one? And then apparently touch this guy and eat with him and over 40 days see him do miracles. That doesn't seem like that would happen. Certainly not in front of 500 either. That would be another problem. And then probably the biggest hole in hallucination theory, other than the fact it's stupid, is the empty tomb. If Jesus was, or if the disciples were hallucinating about Jesus, the fastest way the Jews and or the Romans could have squashed it, and even the disciples would have done this, they'd have the first thing they'd do is go to the tomb. Did we really see him alive? Oh, but we better check the tomb. Is he real? No, his body's there. It must have been a hallucination. I mean, the hallucination theory doesn't work.
That's good.
Well, while you're on the topic of hallucinations and I guess somewhat neuroscience segue, you argue that if we are just purely material beings, then reasoning itself collapses into a chemical determinism. So how does that critique engage with popular neuroscience of today? And do you see limits in neuroscience's, I think I'm saying that right, neuroscience's explanatory power?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael, because materialism, as it's also called naturalism or atheistic materialism, the idea that there's no immaterial realm, everything is just molecules bumping into one another. If that were the case, there would be no way to trust our thoughts because we're not really thinking, we're just reacting. We're no different than a Coke can fizzing. Okay. I mean, if that were the case, and you asked that question you just asked, how is it that if we're just molecular machines, if we're just moist robots, how am I even responding to your question? How do I even understand it and at least put sentences together that appear to be the fact that I'm dealing with your question? If we're just moist robots, it wouldn't make any sense. I love what C.S. Lewis said about this. He said this. He said, suppose there were no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Boom. You can't say it better than that. If we're just moist robots, we shouldn't believe anything we think. And anybody that tries to prove materialism through neuroscience has to assume materialism is false. Why? Because they have to follow the evidence where it leads. And that requires free thinking. That requires a mind that can follow the evidence where it leads. If the researchers themselves are just moist robots, if materialism's true, there's no way to know it's true. Because the very researchers trying to discover whether or not it's true are just molecular machines as well. So it's a practically self-defeating position because you can't prove it. You can only take it by faith. And if you take it by faith, then everything you think is suspect, including the thought you have that materialism is true, because you didn't prove it. You can't prove it. You're not a free will creature. You're just a molecular machine. So that makes, in my mind, which is my mind, not just my brain, in my mind, it defeats the most common form of atheism today, and that is materialism. It makes reason impossible. If reason's impossible, you can't prove anything, including atheism.
Okay, now let's tie this back to your book's thesis of stealing from God. So it's this idea that atheists are stealing sort of the underlying premise of their arguments against God. That underlying premise and assumption is rooted in Christian principles. So even this idea of rational thought that the atheist is using to argue against God, help us tie the thread there to how this is stealing from Christianity and maybe how we think about reason.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't necessarily be Christianity, but some sort of theism or deism, as you put it earlier, Michael. This idea of reason, like, why do the laws of logic exist? In fact, I'll give you an example. This happened at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they love the Bible there about as much as the University of California at Berkeley does. And so
Berkeley.
we're going to Berkeley, by the way, in November. So anyway,
awesome.
I gave the argument for the beginning of the universe, cosmological argument, where I concluded, like I did earlier, there's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial being out there, right? And this atheist got up to the microphone and he said, "Can you name anything else that is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial?" And I said, "Yes, the laws of logic." And he said, "Well, I would argue that the laws of logic don't exist then." And so I said, "So you're saying they do exist?" He said, "No, I'm saying they don't exist." I said, "No, you're saying they do exist." He says, "No, I'm saying they don't." I said, "You're saying they do." He said, "How am I saying they do?" I said, "Because you're using the laws of logic right now to refute what I'm saying. You're contradicting my point. You're using the very laws you're denying. That's self-defeating." And after a bit of back and forth, I said, "Are you trying to say that the laws of logic are human conventions, that we kind of invent them?" And he said, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I said, "Okay, let me ask you a question. Before there was any human beings on the earth, was the statement, 'There are no human beings on the earth,' true?" And he didn't like that. He finally reluctantly admitted, yeah, it would be true, which shows that the laws of logic are not grounded in our minds. They're not invented by our minds. Our minds use the law of logic, but they're grounded elsewhere. What's the source of the laws of logic? The source of the laws of logic come from the source and sustainer of all things, God. Now, how do we know it's the Christian God? We don't, just from this argument. That's what I'm saying. It could be just a generic, could be Allah, right? Or it could be just the generic God of Thomas theism.
Jefferson. Yeah,
it could be the Thomas Jefferson God, right? The creator God, okay? But that seems to be the most reasonable answer, that the laws of logic and the laws of mathematics, by the way, are grounded in the nature of God. I mean, when you think about this, why is the universe so describable by mathematics? Why can we write stuff on a chalkboard or on our computer, equations that actually apply to the world out there? Because this universe, this reality is set up by a mind and maintained by a mind. And so I'm saying that reason, I mentioned that acronym before, crimes, R in crimes is reason. That atheists try and say they're the beacons of reason when reason wouldn't even exist unless God existed. The laws of logic wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist. And so they have to steal arguments. They have to steal the laws of reason, the laws of logic from God in order to try and claim he doesn't exist.
How does reason intersect with the Christian doctrine and Judaic doctrine of Imago Dei, that human beings are made in the image of God?
Yeah, that's something that theologians debate. What does that really mean? At a minimum, it means that we are not just different from the animals in degree, we're different from the animals in kind, that we can reason to conclusions. We have, to a certain extent, the mind of God. Philip Johnson was famously said, he's the guy that wrote Reason in the Balance, the Berkeley law professor, the Berkeley law professor, who said that our minds are made in the image of the great mind, that we have the ability to reason, not just instinct. We're not just instinct. We can conclude, we can do syllogisms, right? We can reason to a conclusion. And at a minimum, the image of God means that we're reasonable beings who also have moral responsibility. So we can decide to do good or to do evil. You know, when a lion kills a giraffe, he's not murdering the giraffe. But when we kill another human being, if it's in an unjustified way, that would be murder. It's immoral for us to do so. And another way to look at the image of God, I think, is the fact that we are God's imagers on earth. We are his ambassadors, as Paul would put it. You know, back in the day, the only person that supposedly had the image of God was the king. Jesus comes along, or I should say Moses comes along and says, no, everybody has the image of God. That's revolutionary when you think about it. Mm-hmm. And that's how the whole thing started. And everything that degrades from there is the responsibility of sin, or sin brought it. You know, why do we have slavery for so many years? Sin, right? Well, no, but people are made in the image of God. Well, we don't think these people are made in the image of God. Okay, why do we have the Holocaust? Well, these people are subhuman, right? Every sin, in many cases, or most sins, come from the fact that we don't respect the image of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm curious, as we're talking about image of God, that takes us to Genesis 1 and the creation of male and female made in the image of God. I'm curious how you would interpret I think I know, but talk to us just about evolution, and maybe even some specific cases where, they point to the Neanderthal and the Homo erectus and these other kind of sort of pre-Homo sapien type of beings, and how that all fits into the equation. So if you could speak to the evolution issue, and maybe in light of those specific examples.
Well, there's two kinds of evolution. There's micro and macro, as you know. Micro is the adaptation within a type. We all see that. Whereas macroevolution is adding up all these microevolutionary changes, and you get a completely new type. The first has been observed. Macro has never been observed. It's an extrapolation. And there's several problems with extrapolating micro to macro. I'll just give you a quick, this is very brief. And I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Stephen Meyer, who are really trained in this area, but I try and make it so simple that even I can understand it. And I have this acronym LIFE that'll help remember it. L stands for limited ability to change. You know, we try and say that non-intelligent processes over a long period of time can create all of these different kinds of animals we see apparently ancestrally related. It happens all naturally. But, you know, we use our minds to try and say breed dogs, and we run into limits in genetic change. We can breed small dogs all the way to large dogs, but we can't break the genus of dogs. My question is, if using our minds, we can't break these genetic limits, why do we think a non-intelligent process can break these genetic limits? And time doesn't help either, because there's been research done on E. coli bacteria, which would be like 1 million years of evolution, and even trying to manipulate these things, they still have E. coli bacteria. They're not getting anything else. Someone wanted to jump in there? Someone say something?
No, I'm just kind of acknowledging, like, that's true. There's no change in the type over all of these millennia when it comes to E. coli as a case in point.
Yeah, and it gets tricky with species, because it depends on how you define species. And But the bottom line is it doesn't appear there's enough genetic variation to change, even with using our minds, much less making it a random process as evolution is. The I stands for irreducible complexity. You're probably aware of that argument that says you can't modify something gradually and still keep function. Well, Darwinian evolution is all about gradual changes. You can't modify blood clotting and still have blood clotting the whole way. You can't modify parts of your eye and still have vision the whole way. You got to have all the parts there in order, fully formed, in order to have any vision or in order to have blood clotting. And Michael Behe has made this famous. You just can't modify things gradually, certainly not randomly. The F stands for the fossil record in life. You would think the fossil record would support evolutionists. Actually, it's an embarrassment to evolution, macroevolution. We should have trillions or at least billions of these intermediate forms in the fossil record. We don't have that. What we have instead is what's called the Cambrian explosion and other explosions where, according to their dating, 550 or so million years ago, all these 20 of the 28 phyla just kind of appeared out of nowhere without any fossil precursors. And you find later big bangs in biology as well. They look more like creation rather than they look like evolution, macroevolution, gradualism. They just appear fully formed in the fossil record. And so when you look at a Neanderthal man or something, we don't know if those were human or not. We don't, as Michael Denton pointed out, 99% of what you know of a creature is not in its structural, like its fossil remains. 99% you have to look at the biology, and we don't always have the biology. We don't exactly know what those were. Were they, some say that there's Neanderthal DNA in our DNA, where they interbreeded. Well, if they interbreeded, maybe they're human of some kind. We don't know enough.
Yeah.
And we don't know the mechanism by which, if they were not human, they became human. There's no known mechanism that will do that. And the E is relatively new in the field. It's called epigenetic information. It used to believe that you could just modify DNA and you get a new body plan. Now we've discovered that's not the case, because epigenetic information, which is more the structure of the cell and the creature, needs to be modified as well. And that's not modified by DNA. In other words, you'll never get a new body plan by modifying DNA. The only way to modify a new body plan is to change gene regulatory networks in infancy of the cell. And if you do that, the cell dies. You can't do it. And this is why even Darwinists are now saying we need a new theory, because gradualism doesn't work. They had a big meeting back in 2016 at the Royal Society in London, which basically was, Darwinism doesn't work. We need a new theory. They didn't come up with any new theories, but they were admitting, man, this stuff doesn't work.
Academia clearly hasn't caught up then, because that's still the narrative being pushed in most of the academic world, isn't it?
Well, it depends. Not in the literature, not in the scientific literature, but in the popular literature, it's still pushed. But yeah, like Michael Behe's book, which came out in 2020. I can't remember the name of it, but he starts the book out by saying this: in the past 2 decades, numerous, and I'm paraphrasing, numerous academic works have come out, and none of them say that Darwinism is the reason life is the way it is. They're all saying it's got to be something else, because Darwinism doesn't work. So the popular stuff, it doesn't get to the public till 30, 40 years later. Okay. If you probably heard of Haeckel's embryos. Those were drawings by Ernst Haeckel back, 100 years ago, that apparently showed the similarity in embryos between humans and, pigs and monkeys and all these things. They were total frauds. And they're still in some textbooks today. This stuff doesn't die, even though it's been refuted.
What if I was to tell you that I've actually found a sort of transitional subhuman creature?
I knew where you're going with this.
You know what I'd
say? My co-host, Michael Miller.
I'd probably say this.
Wrong.
You're fired.
You're fired. Okay.
I've got another question that's a little bit back on the reasoning side of things, because we talked about how the very fact that we can use logic to argue presupposes that there are sort of laws that exist outside of our own ability. How or some sort of intelligent design. How does AI compete with that narrative? Does that offer any kind of challenge or support for the argument?
Well, AI is just human beings programming a machine to spit back out at them information that was originally programmed in there, or at least programs that can allow the sifting of information and the compiling of information in a way that is faster than maybe a human being can do so. So computers are built by human beings. They're examples of intelligent design, not random processes.
Okay, and now I want to come back to the to the evolution thing. So, because one of the questions I was wanting to ask you was about how you view, say, somebody who says, "I'm a Christian and I believe in theistic evolution." Well, it sounds like what you would say is, well, actually, not even a lot of scientists are believing in. Well, maybe you would say it like this: even scientists are beginning to question evolution. So maybe you should too. I don't know. How would you talk to a Christian who believes in theistic evolution?
Well, we had an opportunity to ask some theistic evolutionists 5 or 10, well, it was probably 7, 8 years ago now, in the San Diego Evangelical Theological and Philosophical Society meeting. There were a bunch of us in the room with theistic evolutionists, and we kept asking them, what evidence do you have for theistic evolution, and where does God intervene? And you know what the most straightforward answer we got from any of these guys? These are PhDs. Where does he intervene, or when does he intervene? As little as possible. They would never give us any instance where God allegedly intervenes. And by the way, theistic evolution is not really evolution. It's just intelligent design of another matter, of another method, because you're saying there's an intelligent being guiding it. So it's back to intelligent design. I don't know the motivation of these guys, but I would say that many of them are just looking for academic credibility, if I'm guessing right, because if you can use the word evolution, you seem academically credible, even if you put theistic in front of it. If you try and say an intelligent designer's out there, you might not get tenure. I know many people that didn't. You may be laughed out of the academy or blackballed out of the academy. Ask Guillermo Gonzalez, who should have easily been a PhD professor, tenured professor at university, or I think it was Iowa State a number of years ago, when he came out with Privileged Planet with Jay Richards pointing out how fine-tuned the universe is. He was denied tenure because he implied there's an intelligent designer out there. So
there's a lot of social pressures.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we're all guilty of this. This is the human condition. We are more apt to act on incentive than truth. Right? I want to keep my job. I want to feed the family. I know evolution isn't true, but I better say it is if I want to keep this job. Incentive overpowers truth too often.
Okay. Go ahead, Miller.
Sorry. Well, I was going to move us over into the question of morality. Are you wanting to move in that direction, Michael, or do you want to keep it where we're at?
Roll with it.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea of objective moral values, you argue that requires God. Now, how do you engage with secular atheists who appeal to moral realism without theism? What's the argument there?
Well, one question I would ask them would be, how do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? Let me ask you guys, how do you know your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six?
Because we like scoring touchdowns for our team.
Why?
So we win.
Okay, so you're implying what?
There's such a thing as winning and losing, and I can objectively determine that.
Yeah, there's a purpose to the game, right? The purpose is to score more points than the other team, to win the game, right? If there was no purpose, you couldn't say the touchdown was better than the pick six. Only if there's a purpose can you say the touchdown gets us closer to that purpose and the pick six takes us further away. If there is no purpose to the game, all you can say is the plays are different. You can't say one is better than the other. Well, if there is no purpose to life, you can't say that it's objectively better to love people and objectively worse to murder them. Because if there's no purpose, those actions are just different. They're not better or worse because there's no standard by which you can compare them. So when an atheist says, oh, I think, you ought to love people and not murder them, I would say, I agree with you. You just can't justify why you ought to love people and not murder them.
Okay, let's imagine that you have a 5-minute. We'll call it. We're going to make this short because we're almost out of time on this interview. A 90-second car ride. You have an atheist in the passenger seat, and you're driving to. Let's say this is getting kind of crazy. He's about to perform some death-defying stunt that he hopes that he will achieve world fame or whatever. But there's a solid shot he doesn't make it out of this. And the conversation turns to God, and you have that 90 seconds to convince him before he engages in this death-defying stunt that God is real and that Jesus should be worshipped. So what do you say to him?
I would say to him, hey, Evel Knievel, have you ever done anything wrong in your life? Of course I have.
My name is Evil. Yeah.
You guys don't remember Evel Knievel. You're too young. Yeah.
I remember Evel Knievel.
I remember Evel Knievel.
Yeah,
Evel
yeah.
Knievel became a Christian, at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And I would say to him, you have, I have, and if there is a God and there is a heaven and hell, what do you deserve? He's infinitely just. He has to punish you. Oh, you deserve hell. Okay. Would you like a pardon? Would you like to ensure that you don't go there? You can if you trust in Jesus, who not only lived the perfect life in your place, but died taking your sin upon himself. And by trusting in him, you'll not only be forgiven, you'll be given his righteousness. Now, I don't have time to show you why this is true, but this is the greatest story ever told for a reason. Because God himself enters humanity to save you from the punishment you deserve and to give you rewards you don't deserve. So there's only two things you can get if you splat tonight in that high jump. You're either going to get grace or you're going to get justice. What do you want?
Amen.
You don't want justice. I don't want justice. You want grace. So let's accept Jesus right now.
Amen. Amen. Well, I think that's a good note to end the show on. And if you're listening and you're not a believer in Jesus, I hope you'll consider these words and know that Jesus loves you and that he came to give his life for you and to pay the penalty for our sins. And 3 days later, he rose from the dead. We presented some evidence both for the existence of God and also a little bit of evidence in this episode for the resurrection of Jesus. We also have other episodes on this show where that's the exclusive topic, the resurrection of Jesus. Encourage you guys to check that out. So, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. You guys go check out his book, Stealing from God, or some of his other resources. And so, guys, thanks again for joining us. And make sure you sign up for that newsletter, Remnant Radio. We have episodes like this all the time. We love to update you about those in our newsletter. And not just that, but conferences we have coming up, courses. We have a course, really both of those, a conference in October, early October. Tickets are selling pretty fast. I think we're going to be filled up pretty soon. And so make sure you sign up for that, as well as for our e-course, Intro to Spiritual Gifts. And September 7th is the last day that you can sign up for that. It's a 10-week discipleship course and growing in your spiritual gifts. So make sure you do those things. And other than that, we'll see you next time here on Remnant Radio. God bless you guys.
Thanks, Michael and Michael. See you.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank.